There's many different ways to help to support the theory of evolution. We tend to use a lot of evidence. So remember, scientists are pretty concrete people. One of the types of evidence that we use is the fossil record. The fossil record gives us preserved remains of ancient organisms. It shows a gradual accumulation of changes in organisms over time. We can observe these fossils. If you were to look into the fossil record and look at the different layers of the earth, the primitive organs way in the past would be at the bottom layers, and the present-day organs would show present-day organisms would show more recent organisms, and it would go from more of a simplistic to a more complex set of organisms over time, as long as that layer hasn't been interrupted by some sort of mountains or something of that sort. The older, more ancient organisms, as I said, were near the bottom. The younger, more recent ones are near the top. Most of the organisms tend to be extinct, especially the ones in the bottom layers. Those are the ones that are no longer in existence on Earth at all. Another type of evidence of evolution that we use is by comparing anatomy. We consider it to be comparative anatomy. We compare body parts of different species to determine evolutionary relationships. Now, there are two different types of structures that we typically refer to when we look at anatomy. We may compare bones, we may compare muscle structure and things like that. But there are two different types of structures that we have named. They're called homologous structures and analogous structures. Some of you have recognized the root of this word homo. We've talked about that with homeostasis before. Homo means the same or similar. Analogous structures, you can think of analogy from English, and we'll talk about the meanings of those in a second. So homologous structures have a similar structure to them, but a different function. In this case, they have shared a common ancestor. So an example of homologous structures, we could look at the bones of a human arm and the bones in a bat wing. In this case, they both have similar bone structures, especially if you look at the actual bones. The numbers of the bones are generally the same. They may have a slightly different shape. Some might be longer or shorter, but for the most part, you can see a resemblance. They may have a different function now. In the case of humans, our arm isn't necessarily used to fly as it is in the bones of a wing of a bat. But it does suggest that we have a common ancestor because those bones really do show that common ancestral relationship. On the opposite end, though, we have analogous structures. They are a different structure but have the same function. In this case, there is no shared common ancestor that supports these structures. So our example for this one would be a bat wing and a butterfly wing. If you look at the wing of a bat, we've already compared that to that of a human arm, and we know that it has an underlying bone structure even though it's used to fly. A butterfly wing, on the other hand, it is used to fly. It has the same function as a bat wing, but there are no bones in the wing of a butterfly. It's just that nice thin kind of membrane with those little vein type structures in it. No bones though. So they've evolved to have a similar function, but it didn't come from having similar ancestors. Whereas with our homologous structures, we have the similar underlying structure, but they've evolved differently and having different functions now. Another type of evidence for evolution that we can use is comparative embryology. You probably recognize the root of that word being embryo. Early in gestation, vertebrates tend to resemble each other, even though they look different when they're born and as they mature. So this does help to point to a common ancestor. Nowadays, we know that this isn't as exact as it used to be. Some of the early drawings and early pictures that were used for comparative embryology were slightly exaggerated to show the relationships a little bit more. But when you look at x-rays of even a salamander and a human, humans actually tend to have a slight kind of a tail, and that is shown in our tailbone. But as that embryo develops, that tail doesn't actually develop into a tail. It kind of recedes, and we no longer have that tail present, whereas in a salamander it does. So we have a high embryo similarity, and it increases the likelihood that the organisms share some sort of common ancestor and evolutionary pathway. The next type of evidence is called comparative biochemistry. We know bio means living, And chemistry, we did a unit on that earlier in the year, and it involves the different types of chemicals that make up our living things in this case. During comparative biochemistry, we can compare all sorts of different chemicals that make up living things. One of them could be comparing the DNA sequence between organisms. We know that all living things have DNA or some sort of genetic material. If the DNA sequence has a high rate of commonalities between the two, there's an increased likelihood that the organisms share an evolutionary pathway or a common ancestor. We will be doing a lab where we compare the DNA of humans to the DNA of chimps and other organisms and look at the similarities in the DNA sequence. And you'll notice that the organisms that have more of a similar DNA structure or base sequence to them tend to have similar structures suggesting a common ancestor. We could compare other biochemical compounds. You could compare enzymes and how organisms share similar enzymes. You could look at different pigments and different hormones and proteins, and those are also things that would fit into this area. One of the things that we use to represent evolutionary relationships is something called an evolutionary tree or a phylogenetic tree. Although current day organisms might not appear similar or might not appear to be related to each other, we know that there's evidence that points to a shared evolutionary history, and we can represent this using this evolutionary or phylogenetic tree. You can think about when people look at their family tree or your family pedigree, and you can think about great grandma and grandpa having their children, which goes along to the next set of children and the next set of children, and you can compare different parts of your families. This is similar, but we're not necessarily comparing the same species, but we're looking at different species and how they could be related to each other. So typically the way an evolutionary tree is set up is the past history is towards the bottom, present day is usually shown towards the top. This isn't always the case, but it at least should be labeled for you. When you look at the ancient or past, that would show a common ancestor. So if they come together at the base of your tree, there's that common ancestor. And we follow the tree up and look at the different branches, just like you would look at the different branches in a chart for family history. We look at the different branches. And if it branches off from the main stem or the main branch, then it shows that we've had some evolution. Something has evolved in a slightly different path. We can look at these two branches here, and we can see that they both connect down to this common ancestor. They've evolved from a similar or common ancestor, but maybe they have gone into different environments and adapted to those new environments. If a branch doesn't make it all the way up to present day, such as these several ones down here, it shows that that organism no longer exists in present day. We would call them extinct. When we have a branch break off of the main trunk, we call that speciation. A new species has evolved. They've become so different from the other organisms that they're now their own species. Organisms that are closer to each other on the branches in the tree are more closely related to each other. They have separated from each other more recently in time, so they would have more similarities, a greater common DNA structure or sequence, as compared to organisms that are on opposite sides or opposite branches or didn't come from a similar branch. So if you look at this organism over here would not be very closely related to this organism on this side, even though way, way back in time they shared a common ancestor. If we were to compare, let's say, this branch and this branch, they are more closely related because we share a common ancestor right back here at this fork in the road, you can almost consider it. So we didn't have to take as many turns, and they broke off from each other more recently in time. They haven't had as much time to evolve apart from each other. One of the things that we also like to talk about with evolution is time frames. Evolution typically does not happen very quickly, but there are two different time frames that we refer to when we refer to evolution. One is called gradualism, and the other one is called punctuated equilibrium. Gradualism is exactly what it sounds like. It's gradual. So the change is slow and continuous over time. It just doesn't happen that fast. So it may be a slight, ever-changing environment, and the organisms over time, as they're reproducing, as the environment is selecting which ones are most fit, they will tend to fall off and slightly adapt over time. We know that this is typically how evolution kind of takes place. The other type of time frame is called punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium is when there's long, stable periods of time which are interrupted by brief periods of rapid change. This happens when you might have some sort of a natural disaster or even an unnatural or man-made kind of disaster that happens that forces the organisms to adapt to the environment very quickly. Maybe you've had a massive hurricane come through and just wipe out an entire habitat and change the habitat. Maybe it's a massive forest fire that all of a sudden wipes out all of the trees in a particular forest. The organisms that live in that area no longer have their habitat available to them. A lot of them might even have died off. So in the case of punctuated equilibrium, you all of a sudden have large amounts of these organisms having to somehow manage in this new or quickly changed environment. The ones that don't have those traits die off very quickly. The ones that do have the traits to survive in the environment are the ones that survive. If you look at the graphs, you can probably very quickly tell which graph actually matches which type of evolutionary time frame. So pause, try to label them quickly, and come back in a second. All right, so I'm sure you figured it out pretty easily. The first one is punctuated equilibrium. We have this quick change, long period of no change, quick change, long period of no change, and then our gradual change over time. We'll continue with evolution as time goes on, and we will be doing some labs with these concepts in class as well.